It begins not with flashing sirens or a dramatic chase, but with something far more ordinary. A simple black truck driving through Smith County, Mississippi, on a September night in 2014. For the officers at a routine checkpoint, it was just another vehicle. But the moment the driver lowered his window, everything changed. A powerful, unnatural smell filled the air, a scent so sharp and strange, it immediately caught their attention. The man behind the wheel was Timothy Jones, Jr., 37 years old, soft-spoken, and by all accounts, highly intelligent. But that night, he seemed distracted, his answers fragmented and unfocused, as if his mind was running in a dozen different directions. When the officer asked him simple questions, his story kept shifting. First, he claimed he had no children. Seconds later, he admitted he did 3 of them, he said, back in South Carolina. The inconsistencies weren't huge, but they were enough. A quiet alarm went off in the officer's mind. Something wasn't right. This checkpoint, this strange scent, these confused words, this was the beginning of the end of a story that would horrify the nation. But to understand how Timothy Jones, Jr. ended up here, on this dark Mississippi road, we have to go back much, much further. The roots of this tragedy weren't planted overnight. They grew over decades in the unstable ground of a chaotic childhood. Timothy grew up in a world that felt like it was always falling apart. When he was just a young boy, she left home for good. His father, only 20 years old himself, moved them into his grandmother's house. Yet, even in the middle of all that chaos, Timothy showed flashes of brilliance. He could solve puzzles faster than anyone in his class. He could fix broken electronics without ever looking at the instructions. He had an intuitive grasp of mechanical logic. His teachers called him gifted, but also withdrawn. As a teenager, he searched for anything to quiet the noise inside his own head. His thoughts felt scattered, his worries jumping from one thing to the next. Still, he pushed forward. He kept his grades up, sometimes achieving brilliant results. He set his sights on becoming a Navy SEAL, believing that extreme discipline and structure could finally give him a stable path. But the intense pressure of the training was too much. It clashed with his emotional and physical limits. Within weeks, after a failed drug test, that dream dissolved. His life began to drift again. He got involved in small-time crime, forging checks, which led to his arrest and a year in a labor camp. Strangely, this rigid, structured environment gave him a temporary sense of direction. When he was released, he threw himself into religion with an intense focus. He memorized scripture, structured his days with absolute rigidity, and truly believed that faith could fix the parts of him that felt broken. They were just teenagers, working together at an amusement park. She saw something gentle and sincere in him. He saw someone who believed in him, who offered the connection he desperately craved. Their relationship moved incredibly fast. Just weeks after they started attending church together, they were married. She was 19. He was 22. Marriage seemed like a new beginning, but it also exposed their deep differences. The church community Timothy had embraced had very strict rules. His brilliance with computers landed him a highly competitive job at Intel. On paper, they had finally achieved the stability Amber had always dreamed of. But their real life, behind closed doors, was a different story. Instead of buying a comfortable family home, Timothy bought an old remote trailer on a dirt road. He said he wanted a farm life, but for Amber, now with 5 small children, it was a prison. She had no car, no friends, no support system, and a growing emotional chasm between her and her husband. The pressure kept building. He started to question if their youngest daughter was really his. He insisted on homeschooling the children, even though Amber was exhausted and felt completely overwhelmed. The marriage strained, cracked, and finally, it shattered. The divorce was a breaking point. Amber, without a lawyer, felt powerless. Timothy, with his structured arguments and financial stability, was awarded primary custody of all 5 children. But beneath the surface, both of them were unraveling. Amber withdrew, unable to process the complete collapse of her life. And Timothy seemed to lose his internal compass, swinging wildly between extreme, rigid control and total chaos. In the months leading up to that September night, his life was spiraling. He was a single father to 5 young children, holding down a demanding engineering job, and his mental state was deteriorating rapidly. Nannies came and went, quitting after seeing his erratic behavior. Teachers at his children's school filed multiple reports with Child Protective Services, concerned about what they were seeing. His co-workers noticed his growing distress, his strange comments, his disheveled appearance. He started driving for hours without a destination, his mind consumed by scattered internet searches. No one knew the full extent of the unraveling that was happening inside him as he drove through state after state. So when those officers in Mississippi stopped him, all they saw was a man, a strange smell, and a few confusing answers. They had no idea about the decades of chaos, the brain injury, the broken marriage, or the internal storm that had been raging for months. They only knew that something was deeply, terribly wrong, and that it had just driven straight into the quiet Mississippi night. After his marriage fell apart, Timothy Jones Jr.'s life looked functional from the outside, but internally, it was collapsing. He kept his job at Intel a role, demanding precision and calm focus, but his performance was slipping. Supervisors noticed missed deadlines and distracted behavior. He'd seemed lost in thought, detached from the world around him. He always insisted everything was fine, but his colleagues could feel the tension, like static electricity in the air. At home, things were even worse. His children's school sent multiple welfare concerns to South Carolina Social Services. Teachers noted signs of emotional distress and heard about the strict discipline at home. The agency made Timothy sign agreements, promising to maintain a safe environment and avoid harsh punishments. He signed them, but the cracks in his life just kept getting wider. The constant turnover of nannies revealed even more instability. The first few described a spotless home and a father who was deeply involved in his children's lives. But over time, the environment changed. Food supplies became inconsistent, schedules grew rigid, and a heavy, tense atmosphere filled the house. One young nanny named Crystal noticed behavior that truly worried her. The rules were too strict, the expectations for the children were intense, and the emotional pressure was suffocating. She left, sensing that something was deeply wrong, that Timothy was unraveling. The nanny who came after her walked into a completely different home. It was cluttered, disorganized, and chaotic. The once orderly life had completely collapsed. She immediately reported her concerns to the Social Services Agency. Despite the continuous reports from teachers and nannies, the situation remained tangled and unclear. A big part of the problem was that whenever Timothy was questioned, he could appear composed, rational, and in control. He was an expert at masking the storm that was brewing inside him. By late August of 2014, Timothy was holding his life together by a thread. The combined weight of stress, isolation, and his lifelong inner struggles was becoming overwhelming. His internet search history from those days paints a disturbing picture, not of a man with a plan, but of a mind in profound confusion. He looked up campgrounds, RV parks, travel routes, new towns, and even countries without extradition laws. There was no single direction, just a desperate search for an escape route from his own life. Over the next several days, his phone pinged across multiple states. His family and colleagues tried desperately to reach him. His father, grandmother, ex-wife, nanny, and coworkers all called, but their calls either went unanswered or were met with vague, contradictory replies. One moment, he claimed he was coming home soon. The next, he said he was starting a new life somewhere else entirely. His grandmother, frantic with worry, called him 23 times in a single day. His ex-wife begged to speak to the children, but he wouldn't let her. His employer just wanted to know if he was ever coming back to work. But Timothy had drifted into a quiet, unsettled place in his mind, where fear and confusion had completely taken over. He just kept driving through South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, New Jersey, Mississippi, with no clear destination or purpose. The things he bought along the way only revealed more confusion. He purchased camping gear, cleaning materials, safety goggles, a bucket, and a collection of other random household items. Investigators would later call this a trail of scattered decisions, each one showing a mind in disarray, not one following a calculated plan. By September 5th, the trail grew colder and more concerning. Timothy's phone was powered on only for brief moments, making him nearly impossible to track. He seemed to be avoiding populated areas, stopping on remote roads, sleeping in his car, and constantly searching the internet for solutions to problems he couldn't even articulate. On September 6th, something shifted. His car was spotted in rural Alabama, far from his original route. He stopped near a wooded clearing, stayed for a short time, and then just kept driving. Whatever internal battle he was fighting seemed to have pushed him past the point of no return. Hours later, as night fell over Mississippi, Timothy approached a police checkpoint. It was the last place he would have expected to be noticed. But a strange scent coming from his vehicle and the utter confusion in his answers immediately raised red flags. When officers asked about his children, his story changed from one second to the next. They contacted his family and quickly learned that the children hadn't been seen in days. Within minutes, Timothy was in custody. Within hours, investigators began to realize that the story unfolding was unlike anything they had ever encountered. And within days, the entire country would learn the name Timothy Jones Jr. and the horrifying truth of what he had done. Once Timothy was detained, his conflicting answers immediately signaled to investigators that something was deeply wrong. He appeared anxious, yet there was a strange sense of relief, as if being forced to stop his endless drive had lifted a heavy weight from his shoulders. Detectives observed his behavior closely. He would swing between moments of clear confusion and sharp clarity, between raw emotional distress and a detached, almost chilling calmness. This inconsistency was the first major clue that they were dealing with more than just a simple case. As the interviews continued, Timothy slowly began to piece together the story of his journey across multiple states. He spoke of feeling completely overwhelmed, of not knowing what to do or where to go. He described hearing internal thoughts that weren't his own, thoughts that pushed him deeper into a spiral of fear and paranoia. His account was fragmented, a puzzle of a mind in turmoil. Investigators turned their attention to his vehicle, searching for any physical evidence that could corroborate his story or shed light on his state of mind. Inside, they found a bizarre collection of items. There were everyday things mixed with children's belongings, and a series of handwritten notes. These notes were particularly revealing. They weren't concrete plans, but rather desperate. Scattered lists phrases like clean car, find direction, camping supplies, protect kids, remove danger, and travel options. It looked like a frantic attempt by a spiraling mind to impose some kind of order on its own chaos. Alongside these disturbing notes were items that painted a very different picture. They found personal belongings of the children, crayon drawings, little articles of clothing, small toys, and even letters they had written to their mother. These discoveries humanized the situation, showing a father who, at least at one point, had been deeply and lovingly involved in his children's lives. It was a heartbreaking contrast to the man they were now interviewing. To understand the full picture, a team of experts was brought in over the next several days. Psychologists, mental health specialists, and forensic analysts all evaluated Timothy, but their assessments varied widely. Some believed he was suffering from long-standing mental health challenges, likely triggered and intensified by extreme stress, emotional strain, and unresolved trauma from his own childhood. They saw a man who had broken under immense pressure. However, another group of experts argued that Timothy was more aware of his actions than he let on. They pointed to his scattered travel patterns and his internet search history as evidence of a calculated attempt to hide his movements and his choices. Was he a victim of his own mind, or was he a manipulative individual trying to cover his tracks? This very question, this fundamental ambiguity in his behavior, made his case one of the most complex and debated of the decade. Detectives repeatedly pressed him for a clear reason, asking what could have possibly led him to do what he did. His explanations remained as inconsistent as his demeanor. In some moments, he would insist with genuine conviction that he never intended any harm. In others, he would break down, expressing profound remorse and confusion, saying he believed he was protecting his children from some unseen, indescribable threat. He spoke of moments where the world around him felt distorted, as if he were living in a nightmare. He mentioned feeling pursued, not by people, but by abstract ideas and threats that no one else could see. He described hearing an internal voice, a kind of guidance telling him that the children were in danger, or even that they were plotting against him. Experts later connected these statements to possible psychosis, a severe trauma response, or a complete emotional collapse. The lines between reality and delusion had seemingly blurred entirely for him. Finally, after days of questioning, Timothy agreed to help. He told investigators he would lead them to the last place he had stopped with his children. On September 10th, they followed his directions, a grim procession heading into the dense woods of Alabama. When they arrived at the clearing he described, the long and frantic search came to a tragic end. But this discovery was only the beginning of a long and arduous legal process, one that would force the courts to confront not just the events themselves, but the deeply complicated psychological history that lay behind them. As the investigation deepened, evidence from Timothy's home life added even more layers of complexity. It became clear that the crisis hadn't appeared out of nowhere. Teachers had documented months of concerning behavior from the children. They noted signs of withdrawal, chronic exhaustion, and visible emotional stress. Social services had been involved, requiring Timothy to sign agreements promising to provide a stable and safe environment for his kids. Nannies who had worked for the family had also come forward, raising their own concerns about the tense and unstable atmosphere in the home. Each piece of information contributed to a broader, more tragic picture. A man under extreme emotional strain, trying and failing to manage 5 young children, a demanding career, and a silent inner battle that he had likely been fighting alone since he was a child himself. He was isolated, overwhelmed, and slowly unraveling. But amidst all the darkness and confusion, one detail stood out, impacting everyone who heard it. It was the children's unwavering and profound affection for their father. Despite the household tension, despite the instability, despite their father's erratic behavior, every single witness, teachers, friends, nannies all agreed on one heartbreaking fact. The children adored him. They drew him pictures. They wrote him loving notes. They spoke about him with fondness and pride at school. The bond between them was undeniable, powerful, and now utterly devastating. This stark contrast, the deep, genuine love that existed alongside such tragedy, became the emotional core of the entire case. It was a story that wasn't just about a crime, but about the catastrophic failure of a family, the silent struggles of mental health, and the terrible, heartbreaking space between love and loss. It forced everyone to ask how someone so loved could be at the center of something so terrible. The trial of Timothy Jones Jr. began in May of 2019, and the courtroom was packed. Journalists, attorneys, mental health professionals, and family members filled the seats, all there to witness the culmination of a case that was staggering in its complexity. It wasn't just about the horrifying events that brought everyone there, but about the decades of emotional history that had led up to them. The air was thick with tension and unanswered questions. How could a father do this to his own children? What pushed a seemingly ordinary man to commit an act of unimaginable cruelty? The prosecution and the defense were about to present two very different narratives to try and answer those questions. For the prosecution, the case was clear. They focused intently on Timothy's actions in the days following the incident. They argued that his decisions to drive across multiple states, his attempts to cover his tracks, and his eventual disposal of the evidence all pointed to one thing: a man who knew exactly what he was doing and understood the consequences. They painted a picture of a calculated individual who was not lost in a psychotic break, but was acting with a chilling sense of purpose and responsibility for his actions. To them, this was not a story of mental collapse, but one of deliberate, cold-blooded murder. The defense, however, presented a starkly different story. They delved deep into Timothy's past, highlighting a long and painful battle with severe emotional instability. They spoke of a difficult childhood, marked by trauma that left deep psychological scars. They described a man grappling with immense stress, isolation, and a history of substance use. Their argument was that Timothy wasn't a monster, but a man broken by life, whose mind had finally shattered under unbearable pressure. They weren't trying to excuse his actions, but to explain them as the tragic outcome of a life defined by struggle. To support their arguments, a parade of expert witnesses took the stand. The courtroom listened as various mental health professionals offered their diagnosis. Some described symptoms they felt were consistent with schizophrenia, a disorder characterized by a break from reality. Others suggested bipolar disorder, with its extreme mood swings, or schizoaffective disorder, which combined symptoms of both. The testimony was a complex web of clinical terms and psychological theories, each one trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. The debate among the experts was intense. Some argued that the combined weight of Timothy's past brain injuries, the immense stress of his failing marriage and single fatherhood, his profound isolation, and his substance use could have easily triggered a severe, acute psychotic episode, a complete mental break from reality. In this state, they argued, his perceptions would have been so severely distorted that he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. But other experts strongly disagreed. They insisted that despite his struggles, Timothy understood what he was doing. They pointed to his organized, methodical behavior after the crime as proof that his cognitive functions were intact. They believed his actions were driven by anger, resentment, and a desire for control, not by a fractured psyche. The jury was left to weigh these conflicting expert opinions, trying to piece together a coherent picture of Timothy's state of mind. Then, in one of the most heart-wrenching moments of the trial, his ex-wife Amber took the stand. But she didn't speak with anger or rage. Her testimony was filled with a profound and heavy grief. She painted a picture of their early life together, a life once filled with hopes and dreams for their family. She described the slow, painful deterioration of their marriage, the love that faded into confusion and fear. Amber explained the deep sense of isolation she felt as she watched the man she loved change. She navigated a confusing landscape of erratic behavior, struggling to understand what was happening inside Timothy's mind. She made it clear that while their relationship had fallen apart, she never, in her wildest nightmares, imagined a future where their family would be fractured in such a devastating and final way. Her testimony was a raw and painful look at the human side of the tragedy, reminding everyone in the room of the family that was lost. After weeks of this emotional and complex testimony, and hours of powerful closing arguments from both sides, the case was finally handed over to the jury. The courtroom fell silent as they filed out to begin their deliberations. The wait was agonizing. Everyone held their breath, anticipating a verdict that would bring some form of resolution, but knowing that no outcome could ever truly heal the wounds left by this tragedy. The minutes stretched into hours. When the jury finally returned, the silence in the room was absolute. They had reached a decision in just under 2 hours. The foreman stood, and the verdict was read. Timothy Jones, Jr. was found guilty. He was subsequently sentenced under the gravest category allowed by South Carolina law, the death penalty. He was moved to Kirkland Correctional Institution, placed in solitary confinement, and made to wear the green uniform reserved for individuals on death row. And that is where he remains to this day. In the aftermath of the verdict, communities across the country were left to reflect on the immense complexity of the case. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a tragic collision of so many different factors: deep-seated childhood trauma, untreated and spiraling, mental health struggles, the emotional collapse of a family, and the systemic gaps in a society that failed to intervene effectively when it was needed most. Looking back, every sign was a warning that went unheeded. The reports from concerned teachers, the worries expressed by the family's nanny, Timothy's own clear emotional instability, and increasingly erratic behavior, they were all red flags. They were desperate signals from a man and a family in crisis, but help never came in time. The story served as a stark and painful reminder of how easily people can fall through the cracks. But perhaps the most lasting and heartbreaking impact of this story isn't found in the legal verdict or the psychological debates. It rests in the memory of 5 innocent children: Elias, Nathan, Gabriel, me, and Abigail. The drawings, letters, and photographs collected from their home became powerful symbols of an innocent, joyful world caught in the middle of a storm they could never have understood. These mementos are all that remain of their bright, beautiful lives. Ultimately, the story of Timothy Jones, Jr. doesn't conclude with a sense of closure. It ends with a lingering, haunting reflection. It stands as a powerful reminder that our internal struggles, our emotional and psychological battles, when they are ignored, misunderstood, or left fester in the dark, can grow into something larger and more destructive than any one person can bear alone. That is why this case remains one of the most haunting in modern history, not because of its sensational details, but because of the profound and fragile humanity at its very core. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Crimology, and step deeper into the dark with us.